Recording in progress. All right, you guys. Well, welcome. We are gathered here today to have a conversation about nursing and the things that may or may not come along with that. I'm going to introduce myself quickly. I'm the director of operations for a treatment center based out of Draper, Utah called Deer Hollow. We specialize in the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. We're locally owned. We have grown a lot in the last almost 10 years. We've been open now, but we really specialize in working with veterans, first responders, and healthcare workers. So really, this entire conversation to start out, we wanted to raise awareness, especially in the healthcare industry, about how they experience, you guys experience, as we'll come to know and hear in a few minutes, can experience things that really accumulate and create a lot of emotional, physical, and social, psycho, spiritual issues in our lives, known as a lot of the time PTSD. So we'll get into that. I want to start out really quickly doing introduction. So I want to give each of you a couple minutes to sort of talk to us about your background, both in where you came from healthcare and then maybe what you were experiencing to come to the place that we all know each other, which is Deer Hollow. So let's start with Jenny. Before that, actually, let me introduce Lisa Ferguson. Lisa is the director of admissions with Deer Hollow. Lisa, do you want to do a quick intro of yourself, how long you've been at Deer Hollow, and your sort of main objective for this conversation being that you're not sort of in the healthcare space in the same way that I am not?
Yeah. Yes, my name is Lisa Ferguson. I am the Director of Admissions at Deer Hollow, and I have been here for just over 6 years. And I have witnessed, as Megan mentioned, kind of just constantly changing, constantly looking at our clinical team is constantly looking at PTSD and treatment modalities all the time, and those have shifted quite a bit since I've been here. But the we are starting to see a lot of medical professionals reaching out for help. And so I thought that this would be a good opportunity because there is a stigma, I feel like. And there's also some education that needs to be brought to nurses and doctors about, this is what I'm experiencing. Is it PTSD? And so that's why I was excited to have all of you join us because you do have varied stories, and I'm looking forward to being able to share them with your community as much as possible.
All in the essence of trying to help gain awareness for people that might not really know what they're experiencing, right? So hopefully lending a little bit of a platform to have your voices will help people digest what may or may not be going on. So with all of that said, I want to, the main point in this conversation is to provide that platform and let people know that there is help. So I want to give you as much time as possible, starting with Jenny, to do a bit of an intro, a little bit of a background, a little bit of sort of your experience. And then we'll kind of move along the conversation as needed. So Jenny, why don't you start us off with a little bit about you?
Sure. Thanks, Megan. I'm glad that you guys, thanks for inviting me. I think this is a really important thing to do. Um, again, my name is Jenny. I am an RN. My background is mostly in ER nursing, and I've also done critical care transport and forensic nursing. So a little bit of a varied background, but all of them action packed. That's kind of what I thrive on or used to thrive on. Um, I my initial symptoms, I just thought I was depressed and anxious, and it just kept getting worse. And I knew the way that I was dealing with it was not a good way, and I could just see where that road was kind of going. And I got to the point that, well, in the time frame of this too is during the pandemic. And I was working in an ER that was like a 40-bed level 2 trauma ER. And we consistently had like over 250 patients in our ER. Um, and I was the charge nurse for most of that. So a lot of the responsibility fell on me as far as um, it really was like field triage. And a lot of nurses, I think, can feel that way. Even on the floors, it was like overwhelmed. So that coupled with just the symptoms that I knew I was having, and I knew I needed help. So I found a nurse practitioner online. I was lucky enough that her and I gelled like right away because of her background. And uh, she's the one that told me that this looked like PTSD. And when she told me that, I was like, no, that's not me. There's no way. Yeah, looking back, being like a trauma nurse, that makes sense. But at the time, I was like, no, that's not me. Um, and she was just really helpful in making me realize that um, the stigma of nursing is that you don't have PTSD. And that I think it reminds me a lot of when they first started talking about violence against nurses and how it's not something that it's just something that you're supposed to expect. Like as a nurse, you're supposed to expect getting punched in the face or getting slapped or having sexual comments said to you all the time. All those things were like recognized as part of the job. And then they started to realize that even police officers that get, violence against in other areas are actually, they press charges on those people. So they started to raise the awareness of that. And that's kind of like the infancy that I see with PTSD right now, which is super great because, like I said, just to go back a little bit to my story, I had that nurse practitioner for a while and she kind of helped me through a lot of things. I continued to numb out and find other ways to try to deal with what I was doing. At the time, I was working over 120 hours a week on all three of those jobs. And I was like, I'm just going to get up, put my pants on, do it again. And I know I can do it. And that's like the only time that I felt like I was focused. Um, but it accumulated in me drinking up to a fifth of whiskey a night. Um, just like all nurses do, go out after a shift and have a drink. But what they didn't know is that I was going home and finishing a fifth after that. Um, I found myself uh, one night when I was super drunk driving up to a mountaintop in my Jeep and just seeing the view of the moon on the trees and almost like a euphoric feeling and realizing that everything was quiet for the first time in a while and deciding that that was going to be my last view. And my plan was to just drive my Jeep over um, into the forest, and that was going to be it. Luckily, I had a friend that called me at 2:30 in the morning in a place where you usually don't have reception. And after a while, she talked me down. Um, I was vulnerable and told my nurse practitioner about that, and that's when she told me about Deer Hollow. And I know Lisa was key, and everybody there was key in making sure that I got there. Um, and that was my first stint at Deer Hollow. Um, After that, I felt like I could take on the world again. It was really just a lot of being vulnerable and like creating those connections of like other people that just like had that grit and had that it had grace with me and just shared their story. And just they understood. Like I didn't realize that there were so many people that had the same type of feelings. Um, and so I came home. I was feeling really good, doing really good. I decided I wanted to go back to work as a critical care transport nurse. I had a 5-day old baby that coded in the back of the truck. I was able to get them stable enough that we were able to make it to the hospital and drop them off. And then I sat down to chart everything that I did there, and I completely blanked. I did not remember anything that I did in that time frame. And that's when my symptoms came back. And again, it accumulated into a suicidal ideation, this time with a gun. And I had a friend that showed up at my front door that, again, saved me. From there, I went back to Deer Hollow. People say that the hardest thing to do is to walk through the doors at a recovery place, but the hardest thing to do is to walk through the second time. And I was so anxious and just so embarrassed and so like, what the hell is my problem? And I was met with nothing but pride and um, connection and another word that I can't think of that's in the tip of my tongue. But it just made it really comfortable. And once I got back into the work of it, um, I realized that I wasn't in the right place all the way the first time I went. And the second time I went is when it really took hold. And I was able to stay for longer. Like I did the PHP and IOP program there. I stayed in sober living for, I don't know, probably 5 months total. Um, and uh, I'm now home. Um, and I'm doing a lot better because I've realized that connection, vulnerability, and having people that really do understand, like the people that I met and still talk to, is what made the difference.
Yeah. Thank you, Jenny. I actually didn't know all of that about you, so it's really interesting, and I really appreciate the vulnerability to come back, and then to talk about your journey. Some of the main things that I heard you say, and I have sort of some follow-up questions about this in a minute here, but the first thing that you talked about was how you were starting to feel depressed. So I assume the lack of the connection to things that you used to find joy in. I just want to sort of like bring words to some of those first symptoms that you had mentioned, because that's what it sounded like made you reach out to your provider in the first place. So I don't know, were there specific symptoms before things started to escalate into drinking and suicidal ideation? What were some of those very first symptoms, or can you break down what depression looked like for you?
Um, it really started like what made it started as depression, and I knew that I was depressed. And when I wasn't at work, I was thinking about work constantly. Um, during that time, especially, and even further back, debriefing like after things just was not a thing. It was like there was a body in a room of someone that died, and it didn't matter. You just got that body out and you put somebody else in there. There was no time to think about it, no time for anything. And that was just, I would think about those patients like on my days off. I would think about them on the drive in. I would think about them like constantly. And those just started to build up. And I really, like, I was having nightmares. I wasn't sleeping more than like 4 hours a night, maybe. And that 4 hours would involve me like waking up sweaty and just like I was right back in those moments. Um, I was super just like anxious about everything. Like when I wasn't at work, I was still on like I was at work, assessing my environment, like looking at, I really lost my compassion. And that was a big thing, is that I'm a very compassionate nurse, and just like most nurses. And I realized that I was looking at people as numbers, even outside of work, and judging them pretty harshly just because of the things that I was seeing at work. Um,
Built
yeah,
up, built up, and built up.
yeah.
I think
Well,
that's, I want to move on to Hannah here, and then we'll all kind of engage in that discussion about symptoms and sort of like just a couple other things in a second here. But I think that that's a very important thing that you just mentioned, is sort of, it almost sounds like your initial finding was like, I'm not myself. Like
Yeah.
this is not me. I got into this to be compassionate and to help others, and I'm completely disconnected. And so it can look a lot of different ways, it sounds like. But,
Well, and what I also heard there was intrusive memories,
oh yeah,
uh, unable to think clearly,
and
irritability, numbing,
nightmare.
nightmares. So I hear a lot of those symptoms.
Hmm.
Hannah, let's jump over to you and hear a little bit about your story. I'm really excited because I have very little interaction with you, so I'm really excited to hear a little bit more about you.
Yeah, so I am an ER nurse. So I've been an ER nurse for about 12 years now. Life was great before that. It was a passion, it was calling, super compassionate. Healthcare was a little bit smaller, less, large, and there was no pandemic yet. So really enjoyed the ER nursing. Felt like things could just roll off my shoulder. I was young. It was a job. Like Jenny said, you take a death and you go next door and you give the meds. And there wasn't a debriefing. You just rolled with punches. So did that for 12 years. In 2021, I decided I want to go travel nursing. I was feeling unsettled. Back then, lots of anxiety, lots of just kind of not finding joy where I was at. And instead of thinking maybe, hey, there's something going on, I thought, well, if I change my scenery, that's going to help. So went and travel nurse during the pandemic, went to pretty underserved populations, similar to Jenny's story, 40 bed ERs, and we're having 42 holds when I get there in the morning, ready for admit, high flows, ventilators, things like that. So definitely was at some points triage nursing to see, who's going to live and who's not going to live. So we rolled through that, traveled a bunch of different places, kind of was isolating during that time. I would try to get out, I would try to go do things, but the work would just knock me on my butt. So I would find myself, overthinking everything at work. And back then I thought that I was getting over it, but really I was just dreaming about it, thinking about it, ruminating about it until the next traumatic thing happened. And then I forgot about it, and moved on to the next traumatic thing. So I thought that was coping. I thought I had anxiety. I thought I just had depression when it got all too overwhelming. And it took this last year. So I just recently got out of Deer Hollow's residential program, followed by their PHP program. But it took until this last year to realize like my symptoms weren't just anxiety and depression. There was this just core feeling of something felt inherently wrong with me. It just felt off. I'm not like everybody else. Why can't I let it go? Why is it bothering me? Why do I care? And like Jenny said, I am one of the most compassionate nurses that I try to be for every single patient. And I found myself lacking compassion, especially after that pandemic, but even more recently, and getting anxious. So it just would be ruminating thoughts when I'd go home. If we'd have a loss, I'd go home and think about it for the next 6 days, 7 days, again, until something else happened. I would have some dreams about it, nightmares, some what ifs. But the main symptom I was feeling was like somatic symptoms. So I would, if I had a similar patient to a patient that I saw before, or a ambulance siren, I'd get that instant clenching in the chest, that sweat or that panic. And I just didn't know where that was coming from. So I had taken a break off after the pandemic because I kind of toed the line and said, hey, there's something kind of off. I need to take a break from this. My awareness is heightened. My anxiety is through the roof. Like, this is just not good. So I went to PACU nursing, and it was great. Except for my system found problems with everything. I was irritable. I was anxious. And even when I ended up going back to the ER this last year, the things that are easy, the things that are mindless, as riding a bike for a nurse, would make me stop and doubt and question and have a little panic with each time. And so I thought that maybe us being nurses, we're very smart, and it definitely can't be PTSD, because we don't get PTSD. We're not firefighters. We're not cops. We're not veterans. We're not all these things that you've ever heard the word PTSD from. And so I was like, it can't be PTSD. I have ADHD. That's exactly what it is. That's why I can't focus. That's why I'm ruminating. Maybe OCD. That's why I'm overthinking everything. That's why I can't sleep. So I actually reached out to my therapist or my nurse practitioner, and she's like, yeah, that does sound like some ADHD symptoms. So tried that. That didn't fix the problem. And so I found no joy in what I was doing. I didn't go hiking anymore. I didn't go to concerts. I didn't go enjoy my friends. Nothing seemed like enough. So I went from that high swing of anxiety down to irritability to just depression. And it got to a point where going to work, I was having those panicky symptoms, that shake, the doubt, the just ruminating thoughts, the inability to focus on the job as it was. And so between that and then my body just shut down, I had an absolute breakdown, I guess somebody would call it. So I was unable to regulate, get back in my body. I was just hysterical, crying for days, unable to go back to work, but I didn't know there were any options. So prior to all this, when it all started to tumble, I quit my job because I thought that's what I had to do because I could not do my job anymore. I was calling in sick. I couldn't even think about going back another day to do it. So I didn't know there were options back then. And so I ended up going to a different treatment center first that I had been to previously after a loss of my dad. Great program, very superficial, didn't dig deep into traumas, taught you a lot of mindfulness skills, which are great. But 2 days home from that, and I was feeling suicidal and hopeless. Nothing had changed. I was still having the symptoms. I was still unable to function in my daily life. And I was told about Deer Hollow. And again, I thought, well, I'm not a firefighter. I'm not a cop. I don't have all these things. This is not a place for me. And I hate IFS. Okay. And it was actually Lisa that called me and talked to me and just encouraged me to give it a try and give it a go. And I remember walking into that residential and I was so, one of my friends said, I could feel your pain. He said that yesterday to me. He's like, I could feel your pain when you walked in there. And I wasn't the joyful, I wasn't outgoing, I wasn't compassionate, I wasn't helping others, I wasn't doing any of the things that made me happy. And so I met such a wonderful crew there. I talk to them every single day still, and love IFS more than anything I can ever talk about doing therapy, like talk therapy. I've done it. I've tried all the things when those symptoms came on through my career of like, let's try talking therapy. And sometimes just talking about it makes it worse. But IFS was really like the actual key to getting into those parts of me. And then I stayed for PHP, which helped kind of ingrain it, and then virtual IOP. So able to do that. But yeah, it was just those little symptoms, but there was inherently just that gut feeling that something wasn't right. And being a nurse, I could definitely figure out, oh, it's this, oh, it's that, or oh, it's this. And I could totally rationalize or logical my way through something, but it didn't take care of the actual core issues. So it's kind of my journey that I'm on now. I have decided I will not attempt to go back to the ER at this point in my healing journey, just to manage those symptoms. I still get triggered sometimes with some of medical shows or things like that. So just working on accepting those parts of me, I guess, is where I'm at, and working with them and going from there. But that's kind of where I'm at on my journey with it.
Very, very powerful hearing from start to finish, the both of you. I think something, Hannah, that kind of sat with me that I'm curious about, because both of you and Jenny mentioned COVID is kind of like a really obviously a very large thing that put maybe the most stress on our healthcare system than ever has in my lifetime. Do you think that that was kind of like a big catalyst for some of these symptoms, or do you think after 12 years you were kind of experiencing them, and then like was it a slow burn, or was it kind of like COVID hit? And Jenny, feel free to chime in here because you had mentioned the same thing, but was it kind of like a light switch went off?
I don't know if it was a light switch. I definitely think there was hindsight. I mean, hindsight's 2020. And with the knowledge we've learned at Deer Hollow, like I think there was a slow burn, but I think the way I coped with it back when I was in my 20s, when it, when we're having those deaths and we're moving on, and you have the dark humor or the drinks after work with your coworkers, or you go out and you just distract and avoid. And, I would take trips and I'd go hiking, and I still love those things, but I ended up 2020 or in COVID, it kind of felt like it put our backs against the wall, or my backs against the wall. The doors, the door stopped here, but this one never closed. And so it was just this constant lack of control that maybe I was able to do in my prior years, but it was stripped away. So I lost that control. And I think it just maybe exposed that the ways I was coping with all those things weren't actually healthy, and it just compounded everything.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I agree with that, Hannah. You you learn ways to cope, especially in the ER culture and the nurse culture in general. That's kind of worn as your pride almost. Kind of what you feel like sets you apart. But in the end, you're human, and it hits you like a brick wall when you realize that. I also think, to answer your question, Megan, I think that it was a slow burn. And I think before the pandemic, we had problems with our healthcare. And all of us that are inside healthcare, including Lisa and you, I'm sure know that there was problems with healthcare before the pandemic, and the pandemic just like blew the doors off that. And as a frontline worker, it kind of, the buck kind of stopped with us during that time. It was the, higher ups and stuff felt like they were supporting us, but they really didn't know how to support us because nobody knew, because it was something that was new. And all those little things just added up and was like felt like an avalanche looking back.
Yeah. I think that the thing that COVID did, which is both a gift and very much not a gift for the nursing world, is that, and this is something Deer Hollow has believed since far longer than COVID, but you guys really did become first responders and recognized as frontline first responders, during that time. And hopefully moving forward, the culture is that you are treated as such, because that is the reality and the truth, right? Is that you are part of that first responder community. And I think we still have a ways to go in recognizing nursing that way, but part of Deer Hollow's definition of, first responders does include frontline workers, as yourselves, and I think part of the reason I was curious about that is because not all nurses are going to have a COVID, right? We're probably all going to have some event that like exacerbates it. And it sounds like for both of you, and I want to move on to hearing Jennifer, more of your story here right now, but it sounds like both of you did have sort of like an initial ramp up, and then this event, which happened to be a global massive pandemic, hit and, sort of rocketed you through. But the reality is that it was kind of a slow burn even before that. So,
Yeah, I look at it as putting things in boxes, and I used to pride myself as a ER nurse of being able to just put it in a box and move on. And I think those boxes build up if you don't address them correctly. And all it takes is one extra box on that top for that whole thing to topple, whether it be a COVID pandemic or loss of a loved one or whatever it may be.
exactly. It's like a dangerous game of Jenga. Well, thank you. Jennifer, let's move on. I want to pass the baton over to you so we can learn a little bit more about your story as well.
Okay, thanks. Hi, I'm Jen. I'm a registered nurse. I have a master's of science in nursing. I've been in basically public health for 22 years. I am a lead nurse supervisor for a school district that I've been a part of for a very long time. And my journey started about 2.5 years ago during the pandemic. Common theme here. Lots of common themes, actually, that I'm recognizing. Mine happened very abruptly at home. I didn't plan to go to Deer Hollow. I had no idea I was going until I went. It was basically an intervention with my family. I had gotten to a point where I was using coping not the right way. Obviously, with alcohol, anything to numb what I was dealing with. At that time, there was a lot of isolation, extreme stress. I worked from home for the 2 years that we were out of school. And so I was on constant, Zoom meetings. Our guidance changed all the time. And then I was the lead for enforcing that across our district with 4,000 students and 800 employees. I also had staff who, when the mandate came out for the vaccine in Washington, that was something that I was a big part of. I saw a lot of different sides of people, and that was really hard. I lost some really close people to me as well, who passed away abruptly during that time. And so I was isolated, and had this constant pressure of having to like just be on all the time and not really knowing what's happening. So when I tell people my story, which I don't really share a whole lot, I'm beginning to, and I'm actually sort of enjoying it, but I feel like at that time I was on a ship out in sea, and my ship was sinking and I had nothing. At which point, when it got so bad, I ended up falling overboard and drowning. And basically, you know, looking up through the water and just wondering what's going to happen to me. What is happening? And why is this happening to me? Like, this isn't supposed to happen to me, but it is. And so that was incredibly hard. My time at Deer Hollow, like I said, was very abrupt. I didn't know what was happening. There was some anger. There was a lot of anxiety, depression, coping with alcohol, isolation, and the pressure of just trying to do the best that I could for everybody and being the target of so many things. Because when I went into work, which was basically my home office for 2 years, um, it was every day I felt like darts were being thrown at me. I was yelled at. People would swear at me. They would cry because they were struggling with you know, their own situation as far as like, ethically, do I get the shot? Don't I get the shot? All these things. And then, and having to enforce all of the different mandates within like sometimes 2 week turnarounds. So, okay, well, instead of, wearing the mask and doing the 6 foot distance, we have to now take temperatures in addition to that. And then we have to have attestations signed before you walk into the building. And that, again, goes for employees and students. And to see a lot of the students now that I'm still in my same position, and I'm starting to go back into buildings more at times, I'm seeing the effects of COVID with staff and students. I see it so clearly, the mental health, which actually turns into physical symptoms, especially with students and sometimes staff too. So my story is just, it's a little bit different, but I think the common theme is that COVID was absolutely a catalyst for me. It was a very hard, dark time in my life that I have had to work incredibly hard to even reflect back in that area of my life to send some gratitude towards. Um, because I wouldn't be where I am right here, right now, without that story, without that journey. Um, so, I tell people all the time, I'm still on that ship. Okay. I'm still in those stormy waters at times, but I have a life jacket. I have a whistle. I have, a life ring. Those are the tools that I have. So if I do get into stormy waters and I do fall out, which I will probably at times with life, whether that's at work or at home, I've got some tools that will help me that I will not drown again. Um, I feel very strongly about that. I also feel like, I'm still learning and grieving and hurting and all of those things, but there is hope. And so when I share my story, my takeaway for people is that I there is hope. I promise you that there is hope because I am living, breathing proof of it right here, right now.
Damn straight. Jen, thank you. You had mentioned you are just sort of starting to share your story, and I really appreciate you sharing it with us. That's incredibly powerful, and there is so much commonality between all of you. Some of the things that I heard you say that everybody has said so far is the depression, the anxiety. You had mentioned some alcohol use, with Jenny also had mentioned like we have to cope in some way. You guys have experienced such an immense amount of pain and pressure from the careers that you are in, and we have no other option as humans but to cope some way, right? And in looking for answers, and I love the message of strength, hope, and resilience that each and every one of you have talked about, because that is what keeps us here. That's what keeps us going. And you do have life jackets, hopefully now, and you are on the ships, and we're all on the ship with you, right? We're all on the ship with you. Hopefully helping guide. Something that is interesting about your story is that you had mentioned that you sort of had like a quote unquote intervention. So your family was obviously seeing some of this decline with you, and you listened to them and took the message and took heed of that message. And I'm so glad. I'm so glad.
Yeah.
Keri, I want to pass the baton over to you. After hearing Hannah, Jenny, and Jen, you have your own experience and are now also a provider for all sorts of people with PTSD, but specifically nurses. You work with a lot of nurses with PTSD, and there are some rights that people in certain states have with legislature that's been passed that we can touch on. But let's hear a little bit from you about some things that you heard from these three ladies, and then what you just see in your career, as well as, of course, your previous history and experience.
Well, I guess I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Keri Seymore, and I have a master's degree in nursing. I'm a psychiatric nurse practitioner, so I'm board certified in psychiatry. I started in the ER as well, so I worked in the ER for several years, which brings close contact with all kinds of first responders, whether that's law enforcement, fire, medics, dispatch. I did that for a really long time, and during that time, I can, in hindsight, see how many people we lost to suicide, how many people we lost to early cardiac death, how many peers and colleagues over the years who were struggling, but I didn't know it at the time. I left nursing after some personal experiences that brought me to my own PTSD diagnosis. And after a significant amount of time off, decided that I wanted to go back and become an NP so that I could work in mental health. My original thought was that if this could happen to me, I felt really normal. It could happen to anybody else. And that was really my goal in advancing my education so that I could work towards prevention, because that's what nurses do, right? For mental health. I happened into a position as a resident that was working with first responders and PTSD in Washington State who were on workers' comp claims. And I realized, oh, wow, there's resources for people like me. And it became my passion. I've been in this field for a few years now, and I've been with Deer Hollow specifically for the last year. I have a private practice where I work with patients who are on workers' compensation injuries with PTSD. And then I work with Deer Hollow to help file claims for patients who need that and to help increase awareness for all types of healthcare workers as well as first responders who are struggling and don't know it. And that's what I heard the most from this group here is this can't be happening to me, which is a very common thought for nurses, although we are quick to come up with diagnoses that are not actually what's going on. And I heard that across the board. I also heard depression and anxiety. For some reason, we can accept those things about ourselves, but we can't accept that what has happened to us meets the standard of injury or traumatic injury. I signed up for this from each of you. I heard it's expected for me to be able to handle these things. And I think that that is across the board in nursing and in first responders. I heard numbing. I heard avoidance. The somatic symptoms, I think people don't realize that that's going on. I get a stomach ache. I'm calling out to work a lot. I get a lot of headaches. I feel like crap before I have to go to work. These are things that people don't recognize as PTSD. And I would like to find a way to educate early on so that we can intervene before we develop full PTSD. I don't know if I answered your question there.
No, that's exactly why we're here, and that you absolutely answered my question. I guess I'd love to open it up because I heard all of those things that you just listed, and I'm curious why, like, is there a stigma within the nursing community? You all had spoken about basically, I chose this, I signed up for this, this is the expectation of me. Um, is there a stigma in asking for help, would you say, in within the nursing community because you're in a helping profession, or is it why are we waiting so long to ask for help?
I think myself, when I started looking for help, I know and once I was told that I had PTSD symptoms. I remember like Googling and looking things up in the middle of the night when I couldn't sleep, and there was no mention of nurses with anything. It was first responders, it was vets, it was all those things, which just, I think that that furthers a stigma. Not only like during the pandemic, are you called heroes? Are you called all these things that are made to make you feel good, but it also uh, puts an expectation that no matter what you're experiencing, you're going to be there for everybody else and you have to be there for everybody else. And I think that healthcare in general has been that way a long time, just like with first responders and police and vets and all that. You're supposed to give up yourself for everybody else. So it's hard to put that light on yourself, especially if there's not mention of it at work or in the public or resources. As a nurse, you want to see resources. You want to see like evidence-based things like, okay, this nurse has been through it. This is what they did. This is the outcome. You want to read those things so you know what to expect, but it just was not available at all.
Mhm. Thank you.
Well, I think it's easy to avoid, avoidance for me. It's, I had people that were counting on me, and I have always been a people pleaser. And so that was very hard for me. And I think that the culture that we live in, that encourages us to get rid of any kind of discomfort right away, regardless of how that looks for that person, whether it's alcohol or, running or dieting, whatever it is, we live in a culture that doesn't necessarily help us support or promote that because it's so easily, it's just so easy to just it's promoted the other way. Alcohol is promoted, as, oh, if you're stressed, do that. And until that's great until it becomes a problem. So I think that's kind of what I see as far as um, just the culture of things as well.
Yeah, it's just normalized, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
I think it is normalized. I think a lot of my catalyst this last year is just the pushback I received of inherently knowing something wasn't right, and or the situation wasn't right, or we needed this or we needed that, and just feeling like there wasn't that agreement from other nurses. And now going through Deer Hollow, like the amount of vulnerable people in this world that are willing to be open or share their shame or share their feelings or connect in an authentic way are very, very low, because the world doesn't function on that. The world functions on people who set aside their own needs, especially in the first responder healthcare community. We set aside our own needs so that we can continue to show up and fill those extra shifts and take care of those patients and do those things that it creates almost like a, and I won't say any employer has put the expectation on me to work more or to cover for other people. It is almost a cultural expectation, at least within the nursing departments I've worked, that we don't want to leave each other short staffed. So if somebody's having a hard day, like we got to fill in, which we might not have capacity for. And that makes us feel less apt to call out when we need a day because we can't let somebody down. So I think not knowing that there's other resources out there and not knowing that other people are struggling with it too kind of held me back with it. And there are some people that handle it well, but there are just as many probably struggling that we're just not willing to speak about. So I don't know if it's a stigma or just the willingness there to share vulnerably with each other.
Well, you know what I just thought while you were speaking as well, Hannah, is because you had gone to a provider who then said, oh, this is ADHD as well. So it's like not only is there a stigma, but there's also a misunderstanding within our own community of what the symptoms even are. Like there's just simply a lack of awareness that I just want to like tag on there from your own story. Amongst another commonality while you were speaking between the nursing community and police, fire, the on-call culture where you're expected almost to be able to take these on-call shifts or overwork or the overtime and fill the shifts and constantly put yourself in the line of potential further cumulative traumatic events and witnessing.
And I think just to add on to that a little bit, I know my experience with Deer Hollow, no matter what background or career people had, it really was something, a commonality is that there's something else going on. And it's usually something that's way back. And so I think that those expectations are put on us, as we're growing. And that's kind of what pushes us into those fields because we want to make a difference with how we grew up or how things have happened to us. And so I think that there's a stigma that's put on you way back that makes you like resilient and makes you all those things that makes a good nurse. And then it just compounds when you're doing that thing that you've done your entire life, but the need for it becomes too much.
That's powerful and extremely true. Keri, I want to hear your thoughts on the stigma, and then I'd also love for you to touch on, you had mentioned workers' comp and things like that when you did your introduction. So I'd love to hear, and then resources, had just come up a moment ago with all of you. So I want to talk a little bit about what in certain states is kind of going on to provide further resources and treatment for people in the nursing community.
So first I want to speak to the stigma, and it's interesting what came to mind. I'm curious if Hannah saw an MD or a nurse practitioner, not that it would make a big difference when they missed the diagnosis, but part of the problem is the people who are supposed to be catching this when you come to complain are probably experiencing the same thing themselves and may not even, so that might be part of the recognition piece. I know the first nurse that I diagnosed with PTSD and I recognized it was a result of her job that she had received that. I was working in a practice that was working with first responders who had known injury, and I'll go into a little bit more about that here in a minute, from PTSD. And had I not been working in that area, I would have missed her coming to me with depression and anxiety, and I wouldn't have even encouraged her to recognize that this is PTSD and that it's a result of the chronic exposure to trauma that she was receiving at work. Washington State is where I practice. And in Washington State for many years now, I believe I could be wrong, Lisa will know better, but I think since 2015, we've protected our first responders. And what that means originally is fire and law enforcement. We've since added dispatchers, where if they develop post-traumatic stress disorder after working for at least 10 years on the job, it's presumed that that's a result of the trauma that they received or were exposed to as part of their jobs. Just like if they were to develop lung cancer, it would be assumed that it's from the smoke that they were inhaling. Well, recently, Washington State has expanded that with Senate Bill 5454, which went into effect in January of 2024, which adds nurses to that presumption. Nurses who provide direct care, registered nurses who provide direct care, and have done so for 90 days, who also have PTSD, are presumed that that PTSD is a result of their job. What that means is that gives access to care, that takes out some of the barriers, that provides mental health treatment, that provides time off work, that provides, if needed, training into a different field. It brings a lot more resources if they are able to file and receive insurance through workers' compensation.
Which is a really big deal. And the first thing when I think it was 2018 when the original law passed. It might be 2015. It was sometime in that kind of mid to late 2010 era. And then with that recent addition with nurses, the original law you had mentioned is 10 years for police officers. It is 90 days for critical care nurses with direct patient care. And that's not even to try and insinuate that one is worse than the other, but that was the largest thing that kind of like took me last year when we learned of this, is the time discrepancy. 3 months on the job, you are presumed as a critical care, and yet we don't recognize, and the conversation is not even being had, that PTSD is possible for this community. It is
We
insane.
can't afford to talk about it.
It
The
is
hospital can't afford to talk about it.
The hospitals can't afford to talk about it. Well, here we are. I'm sorry to all of my hospital administrators. I'm also in administration and healthcare, and I'm over it, and we're going to talk about it. And we're going to keep talking about it because it's bullshit. It's absolute bullshit. And we have people here who have lived through it and are on the ship, as Jen said, and we all get to steer that ship together towards hopefully a thriving future, whether you're going to go back to work or not go back to work. That's like out of the realm of care that I have. The care that I have is very much towards awareness and breaking down and having this conversation finally, right? Finally.
Can I add one more thing about like the stigma? Because I know I mentioned, and it's kind of unanimous, of like, the PTSD has, in my experience, has always been mentioned with veterans and firefighters and police and stuff. And I can say that my experience at Deer Hollow shattered that idea. I have never been more accepted by a 6'5", 300-pound firefighter, or a, big old rough, angry cop, or whatever stereotype you want to put on these guys. Because in the end, I know it's, I don't know. Pain is pain. And I don't necessarily love that saying, but I have never felt unaccepted or like my trauma was less than or anything. There's just such a welcoming experience when you share trauma. with those in their trauma. And like, that was the biggest thing I took from Dear Hollow.
I want to jump into just a little bit because I get this as I'm typically the person who talks to someone before they come to Deer Hollow. And I get this question a lot is I don't want, like, I'm not a vet. I haven't killed people. I haven't been to war. Is I'm afraid that my trauma is not going to measure up, that I'm not going to feel like I belong there. And we don't just treat work trauma. Like Jenny said, these ideas of who we are really most of the time go back to some kind of childhood response. And we are going to treat you as a whole person when you come here because we all have trauma. The fact that you guys are like forced to just day in, day out, day in, make something normal that is not normal, I think really does escalate that a lot quicker. I also just want to say that, at this point, Deer Hollow's residential treatment, our outpatient program, those are all reactive. We're reacting to you people having gotten to this point where you don't know what to do, and we do. But it's also important, and we've started another department in our company called First Watch. We need to educate, and not just the nurses, but administrators. They need to understand that there is something that they can do up front. Why aren't they talking to young nurses about what this might happen? Like, let's get you some resources. Let's have you start talking about it now. So that's our goal at Deer Hollow is we're going to continue to treat clients who come in and are really struggling and are struggling with significant symptoms of PTSD and trauma. But our biggest goal is to get in front of it, to really educate so that no one else has to experience what you three did. Like, what the hell is going on with me? I'm losing my mind. And I get that a lot. I feel like I'm broken. There's no coming back from this. And you're not broken, you're wounded. And there's absolutely hope and help for what you're experiencing. And, doing things like this, talking about this is how that shifts and changes. So I'm so proud of all three of you, all five of you, and just so grateful to have been a witness to your journey, and really just your courage through all of it, coming to treatment, talking about it, sending clients who are struggling now that that there's help. And also just say that Deer Hollow is not the only help. There's a lot of resources. We're not for everyone, but I am available. If somebody doesn't know what to do, maybe they don't need residential treatment, but they're not sure where to go next, please reach out. We have been doing this a long enough time that we have developed a lot of good resources in a lot of different areas of the country. So
Thank you,
Well,
Lisa.
and Lisa touched on something that I think is really important and that I think that we're going to see now that we are encompassing nurses into this, because as the three of you know, nursing is prevention. That is what separates us from medicine. That is the core of our science is education and prevention and early intervention. And I think that we will learn ways as we bring nurses into this. I think that will grow because they, as our clients and as people who have experienced it, their nursing self will come into it. And we're going to see a lot more focus on prevention and early intervention. I hope.
I think that's why we have to have conversations like this. And I love, and I want to end kind of on that philosophical core of Deer Hollow, which this conversation wasn't meant to be a big Deer Hollow advertisement, but I will tell you that I'm so grateful that each of you had the experience, the courage to reach out and the experience that you had. And we've talked a lot about first responders and nurses, and really at the end of the day, Deer Hollow's core is about common humanity. Pain is pain. The only way on the other side of it is through it, and there is help and there is hope, and there are people who understand and have been there and have walked the walk. These three, all of us really are examples of that, and have been able to, we can all attest to that being the case. So I want to sort of end there and thank all of you again for your time and your experience, both in this conversation and for showing up for yourselves as you have and continue to do. It's very inspiring, and I hope that this gets out there so we can actually smash the stigma for the nursing community and help other people get help that very, very desperately need it. So thank you all for your time.